Greg Kazillo.com. Histograms. Definition of histogram from Wikipedia. A graphical representation of the tonal distribution in a digital image. I like to say it a little differently, in a graph of luminance and saturation in an image. What does that mean? In other words, if we have, say we're taking a picture of the American flag, and it has it has reds and it has blues. Both of those colors are very saturated and very strong colors. So, those spikes on that histogram, which I'll go over later how it works, are going to be higher. Alright, so that's telling us, hey, you have a lot of reds and a lot of blues in there. Assists in exposure evaluation. Notice I say two things in there. Number one, assists. Okay? In other words, it's not the end-all be-all. It's not an absolute. There is no absolute in photography anyway, and if someone tells you otherwise, they're full of crap. So, exposure evaluation is the other part. Are you a little underexposed? Are you a little overexposed? Do you have a variable aperture lens that when you zoomed in, you forgot that you lose a half a stop or a stop of light when you zoom in? And so that's what the histogram is for, to help you to learn that and remember what you're doing, especially when shooting in manual mode. In-camera histograms are generated from JPEG previews. So, in other words, if you have any picture controls, as Nikon calls it, I'm not sure what Canon calls it, additional contrast, saturation, anything, it's going to affect that histogram. I like to turn all that stuff off, leave it at default, and I think I have just a little bit of sharpening or something like that in mind, but that's it. And so that's going to give me a better histogram and a better idea of what I'm actually going to end up with in my end result RAW file, because I don't shoot JPEG, I shoot RAW. So it's a better way to go for me. I do not use the RGB histogram. Why would I? I don't care about the RGB. I only care about the general exposure, to see everything, evaluate everything. Plus, it's bigger on the back of the screen on my D3 and D3S, so that means I can look at it quicker. Makes more sense. Next one, know how to turn it on. In my classes that I teach, I always say, make sure you know how to turn on your histogram, because I'm going to ask you to see your histogram. Because I can very quickly look at your histogram and see, is it underexposed, is it overexposed? Now, the nice thing about the histogram is that if your image is underexposed, you're going to see what's going on, and I can see. I know what my screens look like, and how, just by seeing the image itself, I can usually guess if it's under or overexposed. But I don't know what someone else's screen, or a Canon user screen, or if it's indoor versus outdoor. The LCD screens always look a little bit different. So that's why I always say, let me see your histogram, then you know for sure how good your exposure is. Shoot to the right. I'm going to go over this in a minute, but shooting to the right of the histogram means if you're underexposed a little bit, you're losing data. And you don't want to lose data. That's what the histogram is actually going to tell you, help you to evaluate that exposure, you can do a better job. Last thing, exceptions. There are exceptions to every rule in photography. Hands down, nothing is absolute. When I say nothing is absolute, the best example is for sunsets. I almost always underexpose my sunsets. When I'm underexposing them, that means my histogram is shifted to the left instead of to the right, and I have a blank spot on the right. So let's go over that so that you see it. I'll draw some little things up, give you a better idea of what I'm talking about. So, what is a histogram? It's going to be a little graph, and I'll show you a little picture of one from one of my other cameras, or another file, or something out of Lightroom or somewhere. It's a graph of what's going on in your photograph. All right. The left side over here are your dark colors. The right side over here are your light colors. All right. Now, I talked about shooting to the right. That means that all of this data, all of these lines and everything, are pushed over to this side, okay, to the right side of the histogram. Depending upon the image, and there is no such thing as a perfect histogram. It can always be a little different, a little off for one picture versus another. Even pictures that are one next to another, you know, they could be completely different. So there's no such thing as a perfect histogram. But this could be a very, very good one depending upon the scene. So we've pushed the data over to the right, and a lot of times what happens with that, we end up with flat spots on the left. Now, that's okay. And the reason why that's okay, again, general terms, talking about most images, is because one half of your data, one half of the data in your file is over here on the right side in that first stop of information in that file. Okay? If you underexpose by one stop, you've lost half the data in that image. You're going to have increased noise, a lot of contrast. It's not going to look good. Maybe maybe not as much contrast as you want. It really depends on the image. So in order to make, you know, the way I equate it is to say that, look, it's like shooting slide film back in the day. You had to be right on to get slide film exposed right, looking good, good saturated colors. And I feel the same way about digital. Yes, it has a huge dynamic range. Yes, the Nikon D3X has 13.7 stops of dynamic range, which is a huge amount of data. But that doesn't mean that you can underexpose it and still expect to get a great quality image. So pushing your data over to the right is the way to go. So the next thing we're going to talk about is clipping, and go over that, what it is, how to avoid it, how to know if you're actually losing data in that histogram. Alright, so what is clipping? Clipping means that you are losing data either in the lights or the darks, and that's typically where you're going to lose it. You're usually not going to lose it in any of the individual colors or the blues or anything like that in the middle of the range. Usually it's in your darks or your lights that you're going to actually be losing data and clipping data. Alright, you can see that that's happening by spikes. You'll have real thick spikes, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't say real thick spikes. You're going to have a spike of data that's going all the way to the top. Okay, you're going to have a single line on the right side, probably maybe on the left side. It's very possible to go either way. But that's what's going to happen. All right, so look for those lines. That means you're losing data somewhere. Now, is that a bad thing? Again, it depends on the individual image. All right, if you're shooting a portrait and there's overhead lighting and those lights are very bright, say you're just doing a candid portrait setting or something like that, and the lights in the room are overhead and they're very bright, you're probably going to have a spike, but it doesn't matter because your exposure is for the skin tones and not for those lights. But if you were shooting for those lights, you want to make sure that they're perfectly exposed or get as much detail as possible in those lights or those brighter areas. That's when you do need to worry about those spikes, because you want to make sure that there's detail. And again, clipping means you're losing detail. You're losing information. So that's what happens. All right, you get that spike on that side. And again, I'll throw you some extra examples up so that you can see what's going on. Let's say we're shooting a group portrait in the park. And we take a couple of pictures and we look at our histogram, and this is what we get. Most likely that group portrait in the park is going to be just, we want a regular histogram with good saturation, good colors, and so we're going to want, we look at this and we say, oh, underexposed. Probably about a stop and a half or 2 stops underexposed, depending upon everything, you know, exposure and all that stuff. There's no spike on the right here, but we have this flat spot. All right, that tells us we're underexposed. It's that flat spot on the right. Okay, so what we would do is take this data, we'd adjust the camera, adjust our exposure, either raise our ISO, open up our aperture, or drop our shutter speed, whatever it takes to take this histogram from right here and shift it over here. So let's do that. We've shifted it over here. Okay, and what's probably going to happen is we end up with a flat spot on the left side instead of on the right side. That's okay. And there's a few reasons why that's okay. Number one, as we learned earlier, half of our data is in the first stop of information, so we don't want to lose that. You know, we want to keep all that detail, make sure we don't have any problems with noise, all that stuff. Okay, that's over there. But the other thing is that Adobe Lightroom, all the raw converters, all those programs, any raw converter is made to do its best to bring back and to add detail and bring back detail from the raw file in the lights, in the brighter areas. All right. The darks don't really matter as much. Okay. You always want to shoot for the highlights. Okay. Shoot for the highlights, making sure that they look good, keeping as much data as possible, and then you're printing for the darker colors. All right, you're saturating, you're adding contrast, and that's where you can bring over the black levels in Lightroom or in Adobe Camera Raw, and you can drag that slider over, which will take this histogram right here, and actually it'll expand it, okay, so that you don't have that problem anymore with those black levels. It'll just stretch all this out. And when you're shooting a raw file, there's plenty of data to go around and to actually do that with. All right, image processing in general and Photoshop, all that kind of thing, all those programs, it's a destructive process. So you're actually losing data, you're losing information as you're processing. And so the more you start out with, the more you're going to end up with. And so if you start out with a big 55-gallon drum of water, and you start spilling some, and you start spilling, you spill some more, but you know what? You only need that 5-gallon bucket. You're still going to have plenty of data to fill that 5-gallon bucket with, which is all you need, which is basically your JPEG file. But if you only start with a 5-gallon bucket, and you start spilling, you might not have enough, and it's not going to look as good. You might not be able to put that fire out, or you might not have enough to cook with, or whatever it is. So you're better off starting with extra and more. I think that is everything when it comes to our histogram. I hope you learned it. This may be an ongoing series on histograms. I don't know. It all depends on how many questions I get about it. I hope I've covered everything. And if not, let me know. Greg Cazillo, Cazillo.com. Thanks, guys.